All right, let's get started. Settle down. I don't have a gavel. Just have to go. Okay. All right. All right, welcome to the South Atlantic State Federal Fisheries Management Board. My name is Pat Gear. I'm from Virginia. I'm the chairman. I welcome you all here today. First order of business today is approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? Any modifications? Hearing none, the agenda is approved by consent. Moving on to the proceedings from the October annual meeting. Any changes or additions to them? Hearing none, it's approved by consent. We don't have anybody sign up for public comment. Is there anybody in the audience that wants to comment on anything that is not on the agenda today? Hearing none, we'll move on. The next item on the agenda is the draft amendment 1 for the Cobia Fisheries Management Plan. Mike is going to give us an update and progress update, as well as talk about giving us some guidance on the plan development as far as it's concerned with some of the options we have. So, Mike, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Get that up. All right, so today I'll be talking about kind of the progress made on draft amendment 1, as well as some additional guidance that's necessary for the plan development team to proceed forward in the development of that draft. Before I get into the draft amendment, I do want to update the board on the CDAR 58 assessment process for Atlantic Cobia. The data workshop was previously scheduled to take place in Charleston in mid-January. However, due to the federal government shutdown, that workshop was postponed. The most recent information I have is that the CDAR Steering Committee will have a conference call to reschedule the dates for that workshop, as well as any other assessments that were affected by it. And once I get information from that call, I'll distribute it to the board. Currently, I don't have the rescheduled dates for that workshop. So I guess before I get into the amendment, are there any questions concerning the assessment and the progress there?
Yeah, John Carmichael. It'll actually be a planning group, not the steering committee, that does that, but the Science Center did initial planning last week, and the reports we're getting back from the coordinators who've been working with the project leads is it sounds like they can pick that up pretty quick. So we're not expecting an excessive delay and hoping that we can have the workshop sometime in maybe late March or April. So I hope it won't be too much of a delay.
All right, thank you, John. So now getting into the draft amendment. First, I'll go through a brief review of the process to this point. Draft Amendment 1 to the Interstate Management Plan was initiated in May of last year. This amendment is necessary to replace the current language that is dependent on the Council's Coastal Migratory Pelagics FMP, as well as reflect the removal of Atlantic Cobia from that FMP via Amendment 31. Additionally, the board expressed desire to consider management strategies other than those that are currently in place through the complementary plan. So a public information document was published last year and distributed to gather input on options for the draft amendment. Public comments were received through hearings and emails, and they were summarized for the board last October when the board gave some initial guidance for the Cobia Plan Development Team. The draft amendment was tasked to be designed to address two main issues: recommended management for federal waters and establishment of a harvest specification process. This is a reminder of the current timeline for the amendment. Fortunately, this amendment has not really been impacted by the federal shutdown, so the PDT has been able to move on discussions for developing the document. We are still planning to have the draft amendment available for board consideration for public comment in May, with a potential final approval during this year's August meeting. The PDT has held 2 conference calls earlier this month to begin developing preliminary options for several measures addressed by the draft amendment. However, the group decided that additional guidance on accountability options was necessary to move forward. As current accountability measures have some dependency on how the landings are evaluated against targets or quotas, decisions concerning accountability could impact options for other measures as well. Accountability is being considered in this draft amendment because it is included in status quo measures. During previous discussions, some states had expressed concern about inequitable access. That's what led to commission involvement in this stock in the first place. And additionally, because some questions have been asked concerning the health of the stock due to recent ACL overages in both sectors. The Commission's guiding documents do not require accountability measures in a plan. However, removal of accountability measures would divert from the status quo for this particular FMP. And so if this is desired for either sector, that would have to be considered along with status quo as one of multiple options for this draft amendment. Here, I'll summarize the status quo accountability measures. On the recreational side, accountability is applied at the state level for non-de minimis states. If a state's average harvest over a 3-year period exceeds its annual harvest target, that state must reduce its season or vessel limit such that the target may be achieved in the next 3-year period. For the commercial fishery, accountability is applied through a coastwide closure. NOAA Fisheries monitors commercial harvest and projects when the commercial ACL will be met. When the ACL is projected to be met, both federal and state waters are closed to commercial fishing for the remainder of the year. An additional accountability measure in effect from the Coastal Migratory Pelagics FMP is that payback would be applied annually based on ACL overages if the total ACL, meaning the combined ACL of recreational and commercial sectors, if that is exceeded while the stock is under an overfished status. We've had some overages in recent years, but there has been no payback because the stock is not currently overfished, according to the last assessment. Payback would be applied according to those sector-specific overages. Unless both of the conditions are met of an overage and an overfished status, payback is not applied and the ACL resets each year. This measure is not in the interstate FMP and could not be carried over as a status quo measure. However, because it is conditional on overfished status, if the board does desire this type of measure as an option, that could be considered outside of the status quo measures that get carried forward in place that are under a regular not overfished status. Status quo could be maintained for the recreational fishery by simply adapting some terminology. We would not have an ACL any longer. We would define independently the RHL and redefine a few other terms as well. Some preliminary options explore the RHL specification process and the landings evaluation process and look at these for time periods other than 3 years, but these could be addressed separately without impacting the management response to an overage. And that response is a state-level reduction to the state harvest target. However, carrying forward status quo could be a bit more difficult to implement for the commercial fishery. Under an adapted status quo scenario, states would be responsible for the monitoring and closure for landings in their state, and they would have to keep track of when the annual quota is met and issue the closures within the states. Given the difficulties with keeping the landings under the ACL under federal monitoring and closures, a key question is, do states believe they would have the ability to monitor their landings and enforce a timely closure if the coastwide quota were met? Another note for consideration is that most commission FMPs, which are not required to use payback methods, typically have payback procedures in place for commercial fisheries, but not for recreational. So, in summary, some aspects of status quo accountability could be adapted and carried forward without needing to develop alternative accountability options. However, there are some caveats to doing that, particularly for the commercial fishery. So the first question that the PDT would need addressed to move forward is, does the board want to include accountability options other than the status quo in this draft amendment? So at this point, if it pleases the chair, I'd ask for board feedback on this question. And there are a couple follow-up questions depending on the response that the board gives at this time.
Thank you very much, Mike. I want to open the floor and for discussion on this. It's, if there's anybody, if there's any comments, I see Malcolm and I see Joe.
If we could monitor the status quo, it could work. I know in our state we would have an issue with the federal water closure, and I think Georgia the same way, because that is where our fisheries take place. For the most part, any state waters we close for the breeding stock, and Robert's talked about that at length. I don't know if our state could, I don't know, that's just an issue that we would have to work out if we stuck with the status quo along that line. I don't have a specific recommendation, but it's something that, we just need to consider as we go forward.
Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mike, for laying all this out for us. I think it was a big step forward when we got to this idea of this 3-year period for the recreational fishery, and I'd really like to see that play out. I think something needs to be done with the commercial fishery. I just wonder who that kind of falls to for tracking overall as a coast. I believe there were times where even ASMFC staff was involved with tracking dogfish when council and commission had different, and I wouldn't want to see it go that way. I had some concerns about this commercial fishery. I think that a lot of fish still go unreported, so it's a fishery that's already exceeding its ACL, and yet I still think there are fish that are ending up in restaurants that aren't even on that quota, and I think it's a difficult one to track in real time for any state. And then, well, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Follow up, Malcolm? Anyone else? Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to make sure that I understand if we go forward with the inclusion of accountability measures, if there's options in there that would require states to track their state-specific landings, for those of us who harvest, our harvest is very low, we're de minimis in these. I'm just wondering how these if there's going to be some specific language in the plan that would specify how de minimis states would need to deal with those accountability measures. Would we be equally responsible, or, I'm just wondering if we probably need to think through how that works a little bit. Thank you.
So I know with the way that the plan is now, there's a coast-wide quota. It's not divvied up by states at all. So de minimis or non doesn't really matter when it comes to the commercial fishery. All of that goes into evaluating the landings against that coast-wide quota. So unless there are adjustments made to that, then the de minimis states, which are essentially de minimis for their recreational fishery, would also have to be incorporated in that monitoring effort.
Follow up, Lynn?
Yeah, so thank you for that. And just to be clear, the way that we went forward in a complementary way with the federal plan, I think worked really well for us. But if we're, going to deviate from the status quo, I just want to make sure we think it through.
And next I have Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thinking about the how to monitor the commercial fishery, it's really 2 states landing the majority of the commercial cobia. In terms of how to handle the de minimis states, I think with the recreational fishery, when we allocated to the states, it was 99% of that RHL, and then 1% covered the de minimis states. I don't know if that's something that we could do for the commercial fishery if we go to either the states, Virginia, North Carolina in this case, monitoring the quota, or another entity, that it's at like a 99% or even less of that level to account for overages, but also account for the de minimis states, so they're not having to try to track down just very sporadic commercial landings that may or may not occur in their states.
Thank you, Chris. Anyone else? We have to make a decision whether or not first of all, if we want accountability measures. And if we do, we want to stay with our status quo, we have any other ideas. So what's the pleasure of the board? Joe?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I support Chris's notion, and maybe if we could actually task the TC to look at the coastwide landings for past few years and get an idea if it would be a 1% set aside or what an appropriate number would be, and then kind of move forward with that for the commercial. And again, I'm going with a support for status quo for the recreational.
Okay. And Chris is correct. I mean, it's basically Virginia and North Carolina that make up the large bulk of the commercial landings, and we both have, quota systems in effect that can, track the landings, whether or not we're getting it all. But we do have a tracking system, and we could put something into play where we start to look at it when it reaches some certain percentage and deal with the season that way.
And I think we can just incorporate that into the PDT process. We don't have to have a separate TC task for it. Just have that as part of the option development for the PDT.
So I'm not hearing any objections to not having accountability measures. I have few people in support of them. Hearing none, we're all in consensus that we want the accountability measures to move forward. Status quo. That's with status quo. Do you want to? If you want any others added, any other thoughts? I'm not hearing much. It's a tough crowd. Okay. Roy.
Mr. Chairman, in your statement, are we assuming status quo is the preferred option?
If we have no other options, I mean, but it's a plan right now. So if there's anything else, any thoughts or ideas anybody has, bring them forth now. Spud.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it will help the PDT if we can at least address this payback issue now as a group. Do we want paybacks to even be considered a component of the accountability measures or not? I, for one, think in the recreational sector, no. Just my opinion.
Anyone else on that? Okay, Mike has.
And Spud, just to be clear, that would include under an overfished status. Still no payback at all for the recreational, correct? Okay.
What does everyone think about that? I mean, because Lynn?
Okay, so if we're in an overfished status, we'd have a payback for the commercial sector, but not the recreational sector. Is that correct? Is that how that works?
I believe that's what Spud was proposing. Is that what you were proposing, Spud?
Well, I'm not necessarily proposing a payback for the commercial sector, just making sure that I don't want us to get in a situation where we do it in the recreational sector. And I think if we were to go with something like status quo, in essence, if you have to truncate your season or make other adjustments the year after you sort of reach the threshold, that is a de facto payback if you get really down to it, just without enumerating the fish per se. But the commercial fishery is so small and is unlikely to grow under the restrictions that are on it. I don't know that we need to bog down too much in that. I mean, if you've got the only two states that are the principal players in it can control the harvest through the quota monitoring system and in-season closures, then, I mean, what's the likelihood of us getting into a situation where a payback is really necessary.
Well, we've gone over every year since there has been an ACL.
By what percentage and what margin?
It varies. It's relative to, as you said, relative to the recreational fishery, it's tiny. I mean, landings have been, I think there was 67,000 pounds last year. So it is going over by 20%, but it's still a very small portion of the overall harvest. So Lynn has her hand half up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your patience. So I guess my thought is just in terms of equity, something just niggles at me that we would put an option in for payback for one sector but not the other. And with the commercial fishery maybe being so small, maybe the commercial fishery winds up in the same place that the recreational fishery does, where if the commercial fishery is exceeding its ACL if it exceeds, then the states need to adjust somehow their commercial fisheries. I know we're all on a standard regulation right now, and the feds have been monitoring it and shutting us, closing the season when NOAA has calculated that the quota is caught. But maybe we just need to keep the recreational and the commercial on an even plane, and if the commercial sector is exceeding, then the states need to figure out how to adjust their landings accordingly.
Joe?
I support that, and I guess I have a question maybe for Mike or staff. Do we know in this plan, can you request de minimis for just a sector? Because I think if other states could request it just for commercial, it might give us more options on how to manage the commercial fishery.
Joe, are you asking could we change the de minimis, I guess, the way that de minimis is defined? Because right now it's defined that, it only really effectively applies for the recreational sector, but incorporating the commercial sector into de minimis qualification and status. That's something that could be incorporated into the amendment, yes.
Tony?
I just have a question for the states, because I thought we said on the PDT call that the states don't timely monitor the quota enough for in-season closures. So for the states that have commercial fisheries, is there timely enough monitoring with this pulse fishery that it is to actually have a closure when we reach or get close to the commercial quota, or could we set up for triggers in order to reduce catch some if you don't want to do full closures, so that harvest then starts to drop off so you don't have such large percent overages, or some measure? Because right now I don't think we're timely monitoring in order to have an accountability measure.
Virginia tracks the landings, excuse me?
Timely, that how often do you get your landings for the monthly, weekly?
It's at least weekly, if not daily. And North Carolina, they have a call-in system as well, right?
Yeah, thanks. We have a quota monitoring system for some of our other commercial fisheries. We'd have to go and talk to staff as far as how we would handle cobia being a much smaller quota. But we do have a mechanism in place to track landings on a more frequent basis than the typical get the trip tickets a month later and then see where you are. But yeah, I think it's something that we could potentially do. We just need to work out the details with our staff to figure out the best way. And I think in terms of just the commercial landings information, having the PDT look at when those landings occur during the month, and the seasonal landings and whatnot, that would help us too, as far as trying to get a sense of the frequency. If it's all happening in a couple months, or if it's spread out and then over the year or somewhere in between. I think that would help us as far as whether we need to do daily reporting, weekly reporting, things like that.
All right. I'm hearing a lot of. Mike's writing down a lot of things here. So one of the things was de minimis for having separating out de minimis for recreational and commercial. Considering not having payback for recreational fisheries or commercial. So is there anything else or any comments on those issues that we've just discussed? Not hearing any. Is there anything else you want to see, you want us to look into, want the PDT to look at, or the TC, as far as, information you want going into the plan as a possible option? Boy, I'm not hearing anything. Mike's doing a wonderful job, isn't he? So, all right, Mike?
So just to make sure we're clear going forward, all the feedback that's been given today could be accomplished essentially with status quo accountability measures. Again, like I said, the payback provision is from the Coastal Migratory Pelagics FMP. That's not part of the Interstate FMP, so we would just not add it. So that would be fine to have status quo going forward, which would mean that there would not be accountability options in the draft amendment. That would just be a carryover from the previous management plan, and we would be able to look at some details like the timing of the period and things like that outside of those measures. But I just wanted to make sure that the board was clear that that's what we would have going forward.
I see a few heads shaking. Yes, agree. So, anything else? All right, Mike, do you have what you need at this time?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that discussion, and members of the several of us sit on the PDT as well, so we'll be having some more conference calls about this as we continue to develop the amendment. You have a question, Tony?
Is it the intention of the board for the commercial fishery to close in season when the quota is caught? Is that what the board is looking for? To clarify.
Chris is nodding his head, and so am I.
Okay.
So yes. Okay. Anything else? All right. All right. Moving on. Oh, I got another question. Joe?
So is that a state-by-state closure, or would, if North Carolina and Virginia are going over, would they expect all states to be able to respond quickly enough to?
I think it depends on how you set up the quota in the document. If you're going to have a state-by-state commercial quota, then it would be each individual state would close when you set that up. But if you don't have state-by-state quotas, which I don't believe we do right now, then it would just be when the commercial quota is caught in total, and everybody would close.
But if we had that 1% or 2% set aside, we may be able to address it through that. Joe?
The de minimis states would also have to, everybody would have to close once the commercial quota is caught, usually.
Right. Okay.
I mean, you can write it any way you want. That's true. You can change it.
I have
typically, that's
Lynn
what
and
happens.
then Joe.
Yeah, I think I would like to consider maybe through the plan something where there was like a 1% set aside for de minimis. One of the we had a public hearing in New Jersey, and one individual showed, he was a commercial fisherman, he largemouth gill nets, doesn't target cobia, but his one concern is the closures impact his fishery, and I know North Carolina has this issue with king mackerel, and to I know I've said it before, but I'm always in favor of turning dead discards into, something more reasonable. So I know for at least my state, if de minimis was running on a 1% set aside, I would be able to turn those discards into non-targeted harvest. So.
And Lynn?
Yeah, thank you. So I think I'm right on the same wavelength with Joe. So in our state, because we have so few of these fish, we cannot monitor a state-by-state quota. We're not equipped to do that for this fish. So some sort of set aside, I think, would work well for the commercial fishery. If push came to shove, I don't think it would be ideal, because I'm assuming the majority of the commercial landings are coming out of North Carolina and Virginia. They would be our bellwether. If they're in the position to track their quotas and close, then we could follow suit. We're set up right now to follow Virginia's regs recreationally to keep us consistent. So we could walk down that same road commercially as well. Although, as Joe said, I think if there was a way to treat these little states a little differently, that would be ideal. Thanks.
Roy?
I would support that thought process as well, because there's a cost associated with implementing regulations. And if a commercial closure is required and you have a state that landings are so incidental or occasional that you don't even have landings greater than 0 in most years, the administrative cost of closing that fishery just doesn't seem worth it. So I like the idea of a 1% set aside. Thanks.
That is a good idea. Malcolm?
Just to be clear about this, so if there were a federal closure or commercial closure in the federal waters, would the wording apply just to commercial or recreational only? And speaking from my own state, cobia are game fish, so we have no commercial fishery, period. But as stated earlier, our fishery is 90% prosecuted in federal waters. So if the federal waters were closed, by mandate, our recreational season is closed, and that's what happened for several years. Is there a way to disconnect commercial and recreational, in the plan that's coming up? For would federal water closure be federal water closure, period, or would it just be federal for commercial harvest?
So one of the parts of this draft amendment is addressing the recommended federal regulations relative to the state, and there are options in place, like one of them being, if you're fishing by your state of landing, then even though you're in federal waters, you adhere to the regulations of the state of landing. And I believe that NOAA Fisheries has indicated that they would essentially reflect those regulations in enforcement. So there wouldn't necessarily be a federal closure unless it was mirroring a state closure.
Tony?
And to clarify, the closure would be for commercial fishing, Malcolm, for all states to close their commercial fishery. If you don't have a commercial fishery, then you wouldn't have to worry about it. And if we made that recommendation to want to extend it out to federal waters, it would be just a closure of commercial fishing in federal waters.
Understood, but I just wanted to be clear the way our laws are mandated, that if the federal waters are closed, then the fishery is closed to everybody. And I don't know, maybe we just need to make sure about the wording of it, either in this, and we can talk about it later, or within our state. I think, is that how you understand it, John?
I think that's how it's worded now, but, what I was trying to think about is if all the states closed, there's nowhere to land, then would the federal waters being open or closed kind of be moot? But then I think there's also situations where once all the states that have, in cases where you've divided them up, once all the states that have a piece have all closed, then I think in some cases the feds close. But my recollection is a lot of times that comes down to what the commission does in terms of asking the feds to take action. So I think you have the ability to do it either way you wish to do it.
Malcolm, you're okay with that? All right.
And we'll have this to be able to discuss it.
Mike.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm clear with this, and we'll be able to discuss it some, and then we'll have the document in May. I just want to make sure we don't get inadvertently closed out of the fishery because of the way our laws are written with the mirroring of federal law.
Is there anything else? I'm going to have a long pause here so everyone can think for a second. We'll move on. Mike, did we cover everything? All right. Well, thanks for that discussion. And like I said, we'll be working, the PDT will be working, and we'll be back with this in May. So moving on to the next agenda item, which is a consideration of the FMP review for state compliance and state compliance reports for SPOT. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is the 2018 FMP review for SPOT. We get those compliance reports a little bit later in the year, so we're going to be looking at the 2017 fishing year. As a reminder, in July of last year, MRIP did their recalibration of recreational harvest estimates from the Coastal Household Telephone Survey to the Mail-Based Fishing Effort Survey. Here we see time series of the recreational harvest using each of the different calibrations, and in general, spot increased by about double, but it's fairly proportional for those recreational landings. As this species does not have any regulations based on the weight or the number of the recreational harvest, the estimates that are presented today will use those new FES numbers. Here we see commercial harvest in black and recreational harvest in gray from 1950 to the present. Total landings of spot in 2017 are estimated at 10 million pounds, an increase of about 6 million pounds from 2016, and 317,000 pounds less than the average of the last 10 years. The commercial fishery accounted for 24% of these landings with 2.4 million pounds. That's a 277% increase from the time series low in 2016. Virginia landed approximately 74% of the commercial harvest, followed by North Carolina with 18%. Here we see recreational catch in millions of fish. The black bars are the fish harvested, and gray bars are those that were caught and released. Recreational harvest of spot along the Atlantic coast has varied throughout the time series between 13 and 55 million fish. In 2017, recreational harvest was 23.7 million fish, or 10 million pounds. This is about 10 million fish more than the 2016 harvest. Anglers in Virginia caught 67% of the 2017 harvest, followed by anglers in Maryland and North Carolina. The estimated number of spot released by recreational anglers in 2017 was about 8 million fish, and that's about a 2.5 million decrease from the 2016 releases. Addendum 1 established the use of a traffic light analysis to monitor stock status in the absence of an assessment. It set a threshold of 30%, which is shown by the black line. That represents moderate concern for the fishery. If thresholds for both the harvest and abundance indices are exceeded over a 2-year period, then management action is tripped. The results shown here and on the next slide are the current TLA, and they do not include adjustments that were recently recommended by the Atlantic Croaker TC and Spot PRT. This graph shows the composite harvest index, which is comprised of commercial and recreational data from the entire coast. This index has shown recent decline and did trip in 2017, with red proportions in 2016 and 17 both exceeding 30%. Here we see the composite abundance index, which is comprised of adult spot abundance estimated by the NIMFS and CMAP surveys. This index has shown some sporadic declines, but nothing consistent, and it did not trip in 2017. The 2017% red is just under 30 at 29.4%. So despite the triggering of the harvest index, management action is not triggered this year and would not be triggered next year, as you need 2 consecutive years to trigger management. Spot are currently managed under the Omnibus Amendment approved in 2011. This amendment does not require specific fishery management measures in either the recreational or commercial fisheries for states within the management unit. A state qualifies for de minimis status if its past 3-year average of the combined commercial and recreational catch is less than 1% of the past 3-year average for the coast-wide commercial and recreational catch. Those states that qualify for de minimis are not required to implement any monitoring requirements, and there aren't any monitoring requirements to include for this plan. New Jersey and Georgia have both requested and qualify for de minimis status. So the PRT recommends that the board approve the 2018 spot FMP review, state compliance reports, and de minimis status for New Jersey and Georgia. In addition, the PRT has listed several management, research, and monitoring recommendations in the FMP review report. Specifically, the PRT would like to reiterate their recommendation that the board consider incorporation of adjustments to the TLA. These were submitted in their collaborative memo with the Atlantic Croaker TC. As I understand, states have been working to get public feedback on potential management responses, since incorporating the recommended adjustments would trigger management action. That information was not available for all states in time for this meeting, so the plan is for the board to address that issue in May. With that, I will take any questions.
Any questions, sir? Mike? And I believe so far Maryland and Virginia have had their public meetings. North Carolina is later this month. Are any other states considering having a meeting to discuss possible croaker spot management? I'm just seeing shaking of heads. Okay. Well, that's where the bulk of the catches. Lynn, Chris, and I have had several conversations about this, and I think we're all kind of on the same page, and we'll be able to provide some of the results of those meetings next meeting. All right, we need a motion on this. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to approve the 2018 spot FMP review, state compliance reports, and de minimis status for New Jersey and Georgia.
Seconded by Malcolm. Any further discussion? Any opposition? Hearing none, it's approved by consent. Is there anything else to come? Oh, I have to read it. I'm sorry. I forgot to read it. Forgive me. Move to approve the 2018 spot FMP review, state compliance reports, and de minimis status for New Jersey and Georgia. Motion by Ms. Fagley and seconded by Dr. Rhodes. Hearing any opposition to the motion? Hearing none, motion is accepted by consent. I apologize for that. Is there any other business to come before this board today? Malcolm.
I just wanted to, Mike and Lynn and I were talking earlier, and I just wanted to clear in my head, it's CDR 28 for cobia will be like a year, is that right?
58, and that is projected to be finished by the end of this calendar year. The original final report date was in October, so even with the shutdown, if it gets moved a month or so, that information wouldn't have been available until our February meeting anyway. So as long as we get it done by beginning of January, then we should still be on track to have that available in February of next year.
Anything else? Hearing none, motion to adjourn. Malcolm, and seconded by, I thought I saw a couple of hands over here. I'll say Lynn. Meeting is adjourned.